and restore them to this place. I don't know if you've ever thought of it this way, but Jeremiah, like Isaiah, is really a kind of book of revelation for the Old Testament. It's explaining how God's people should be living in the time of the exile. So while it's mostly in Jeremiah, but in Isaiah there's little parts of it, but in Jeremiah especially, there's this full-throated explanation of this is how you are to live even though you're in exile. So Isaiah is warning about exile. Jeremiah is saying exile is right here. It's about to happen. And then Ezekiel is basically saying there's no hope. The nation is gone into exile. So you kind of see that full picture there. So Jeremiah is kind of like the book of Revelation, which is a letter that John writes to the churches there in Asia Minor, explaining to them how they are to live in that period of time, even as they are suffering under the bondage of Rome, how they are to live and how they are to interact with those people. I want you to imagine what it would be like to live in exile, especially in a place like ancient Babylon. Now, ancient Babylon is located about 50 miles south of modern Baghdad in Iraq. It was founded by a man named Nimrod in Genesis 10 and became early center of idolatry. Its armies by the time of Nebuchadnezzar were seemingly unstoppable, and Nebuchadnezzar in a short period of time defeated Egypt and Assyria and Tyre and Moab and Ammon and Edom. And if you know the Edomites, think Petra. If you know what that city looks like carved out of the rock. Nebuchadnezzar defeated all of those nations. Babylon's walls were 14 miles on each side, 300 feet high, 25 feet thick, and then 75 feet behind that is an inner wall. It had 250 towers along the wall that were some 450 feet high. It had a moat completely surrounding the city, and it was supplied by water by the Euphrates River, which flowed directly through the city. It had 8 huge gates, including the famous Ishtar Gate, which has been excavated, and I think it's in the British Museum in London. Someday I'm going to go see that. You actually get to see Nebuchadnezzar's logo. Do you know what his logo was? It's like the Nike swoosh is the logo, or Adidas has the 3 stripes. Nebuchadnezzar had a logo. It was a golden lion that had wings. That was Nebuchadnezzar's logo, and it's all over the Ishtar Gate. So you have this beautiful kind of azure blue stonework with these golden lions all over it. That was the Ishtar Gate. Nebuchadnezzar built within Babylon using a series of different engineering devices, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which were apparently so incredible. It was one of the wonders of the ancient world. And then somewhere near the center of the city was the great temple of Marduk, was a false god that they worshipped. And then Nebuchadnezzar himself was kind of a godlike king. At least he claimed to be God. In fact, in Isaiah 14, it refers to Nebuchadnezzar and then, of course, to the satanic power behind him when he says, I will be like the Most High. He built a golden monument to himself, some 18 feet high, at least 18 feet high, and he would ride, it was said, on a lion. I don't know if that's actually true. I can't imagine a person riding on the back of a lion, but that sounds a little apocryphal, doesn't it? He murdered kings. He was a murderous man. In fact, Zedekiah, we're going to find out later, he tries to escape out of Jerusalem. He's captured. And Nebuchadnezzar actually brings Zedekiah's own sons before him. His own sons are murdered, and then his eyes are put out. He's blinded by Nebuchadnezzar. We have these stories that, you think that's awfully gruesome. And it is kind of gruesome until you realize there's a whole bunch of other stories about Nebuchadnezzar that are equally gruesome that we just don't ever talk about, such as throwing three Hebrews into a fiery furnace. That's kind of bad. And yet that's kind of a children's story. Here, Johnny, we're going to go to sleep tonight. Let's talk about the three Hebrews who were thrown into the fire. Now close your eyes and go to sleep. And on top of this, of course, he's mentally ill, right? Because at one point he's 7 years long struggling where he's acting like an animal, eating grass and all of that kind of thing, while one of his wives is ruling over Babylon in his stead. So imagine living in a world with a powerful and evil ruler like Nebuchadnezzar. And do you think maybe people are wondering, what about God? What about God? And when you consider the life of Nebuchadnezzar and all of what ancient Babylon meant, it's good for us, excuse me, in this study, just stop for a second and consider what God is doing during all of this time. And the very first thing we find out about Jeremiah's prophecy here is that he's letting everybody know in a time of exile, God rules over everyone. Everyone. He rules the nations. You see this in verse 3. Send this message to the king of Edom, Moab, Ammonites, Tyre, and Sidon. He rules over Judah. Look at verse 12. I spake to Zedekiah, king of Judah, all these words. And then look at verse 16. I even said this to the priests and all the people. So here you have God speaking to the Gentile nations, then to his own people, specifically to the leader of the people, and then to the people themselves and their religious leaders. So he explains himself to the Gentile nations in verses 3 through 11, that he is greater than anyone else who is great. No one's better than God. He says in verse 4, my army is greater than yours, right? You see that? The Lord of armies. Hosts is the word for armies. He's the Lord of armies. He says, this is what I am going to do. And he says that because verse 5, very first part, he says, I'm the creator. I made all things. Everything that you see in this world, I created. I made the earth, the man, the beast on the ground, by my great power and outstretched arm. So I give everything in this world to whom I will give it. Stop for a moment and think of some absolute incredible applications of that truth. Do you realize that our leaders, while democratically elected here in this country, are the ones God chooses to lead us? We have a president, our last president, and our next president. And they will all be people God chose to put into power, even though people are voting for them or even against them. God chooses those men or women to serve us in this way. Because God gives, verse 5, God says, by my power and arm, I have given it to whom it seemed to meet unto me. He gives his rule to whomever he will. And you have all, right now, in this world, you have all of these leaders and rulers, and they have all of these summits, and they have the United Nations, and all of these different groups of countries, and NATO, and all of these that seemingly are saying, we're in control of the earth, and all we can do is kind of chuckle to ourselves because we know every single one of those people are under the rule of God. All of them are. By the way, do you notice here in verse 16, even as he explains himself to the Gentiles, he doesn't explain himself to Zedekiah or the Jews. Why? Because Zedekiah already knows who God is. Look at verse 12. I spoke to Zedekiah according to all these words, saying. And then he doesn't explain, I'm the God who made everything. Because Zedekiah is already aware of all that. Whether he believes it or not, of course, is in question, because Zedekiah is likely not a believer. But at least he knew the truth, was aware of it. He already understood that this is the God of Israel. And certainly you get to verse 16 and God's not explaining himself to the priests because the priests know who God is. And so you can just walk away from this and look at this whole chapter and say, here's the truth. God rules everyone. So he expects everyone to obey his commands. In verse 6, and now I have given all these lands into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant. Do you see that? My servant. And the beasts of the field, even the animals, I have given to him to serve him. Verse 7, all the nations will serve him, his son and his son's son, until the very time of his land come. Verse 8, and it shall come to pass that the nation and kingdom which will not serve him, that will not put their neck under the yoke of him, that nation will I punish. So verse 12, bring your necks under the yoke of the king of Babylon. Serve him and his people and live. Why would you die? Why choose death? By the sword and by famine and by pestilence or disease, as the Lord has spoken against the nation that will not serve the king of Babylon. That's a perfectly legitimate question. So what we have here is really the revelation of the way God wants the Gentile kings to respond to Nebuchadnezzar. Again, from verse 6, he's saying, you must serve him because I have given you to him. Because God rules his creation, he can do whatever he wants to with it, and he can even give it to another king, verse 6, and he can determine, verse 7, how long that king will get to use those other nations. Do you understand that? So it's not just, I determined that all of these kings will serve Nebuchadnezzar, but it's only going to be for 3 generations. Him, his son, and his grandson. And then that entire situation will end. And so because of this rule, God says, if you don't do what I tell you to do, I will punish those who refuse to obey me. And God says, I'll punish them. Look at verse 8. By warfare. Now, where's the warfare coming from? Think about this for a moment. Where's the warfare coming from? How are they going to be punished by warfare? By Nebuchadnezzar's armies. But look at the second 2 types of punishment. Where are these coming from? They may be a byproduct of war, famine, and disease, but where are those coming from? Really, where are those coming from? Those are coming from God. And so when you think about it, what God is saying, okay, yes, you don't do here what I'm telling you to do. You will be punished by Nebuchadnezzar's armies, but it's not just that. You will know that I am punishing you because you've chosen not to listen to me. It will be by disease. It will be by famine. And in verse 12, he tells Zedekiah, this is how I want you to live. And it's really straightforward. He says to him in verse 12, you must surrender. You must surrender. Now, I'm going to tell you, that's a pretty incredible statement. And it gets Jeremiah into a whole lot of trouble with his own people. Because the false prophets are hearing Jeremiah say, you must surrender to Babylon. What do you think they're going to say about Jeremiah? You're in Babylon's pocket. You're actually pro-Babylon. You know how everything's politicized. That didn't just start when Donald Trump came down the little escalator in Trump Tower. No, that's not when things got politicized. It wasn't when Rush Limbaugh began his national syndicated radio show. Things have been politicized since the Garden of Eden, when Eve put on a sign up, Mark Twain said, in the garden, stay off the grass. Everything since then has been politicized. And so Jeremiah is saying, you must surrender. And if you surrender and you serve him and you serve his people, you will live. In fact, he says, you'll till the land in your own country. You will till the land and you will have farms and you will live at peace. And you will be at peace. But refusal, he says to Zedekiah, the king, if you refuse, just like the Gentiles, it'll be the sword, it'll be famine, it'll be pestilence. So the very same means by which God will punish all those Gentile nations, his own people will be punished. And then he says to the priests a completely different revelation. To Zedekiah, of course, he's a leader of a nation, so like the Gentile leaders, he's going to give to Zedekiah the same kind of lesson. You need to surrender. But to the priests now, near the end of the chapter, he says, the temple treasures that were taken to Babylon are lost. Look down at verse 16. And then he says in verse 16, and I spake, and also I spake to the priests and to all this people, saying, thus saith the Lord, don't listen to the words of your prophets that prophesy to you, saying, behold, the vessel of the Lord's house will shortly be brought again from Babylon. Remember, there have been 2 raids on Jerusalem already. And in the second raid, a whole bunch of the treasures of the temple were taken to Babylon. And so here are these false prophets that are saying, hey, you know what? In a few weeks, we're going to get all that stuff back. It's going to big UPS boxes it's all going to come back, and we're just going to have a great time of it. He's saying, don't listen to them. The temple treasures taken to Babylon, they're lost. In fact, he says it in verse 18, and a little sarcastically, he says, these prophets, if they really were prophets, they should be praying that they wouldn't lose the rest of the temple treasures, the few that remain. And he lists them out. And so what God is actually saying here through his prophet, he's saying this, listen, I rule over everyone. I rule over the nations of the world. The Gentile nations, I certainly rule over my people, and I rule over my priests. Everybody who is on this planet is under the rule of God. And we can just stop back in a time of difficulty and just say, aren't you thankful that's true? The difficulties going on right now on the Gaza Strip and in Israel between Hamas and their backers in Iran, and what's going on with the nation of Israel, which is not a Christian nation, is not the people of God. Most of those people who live in that nation are godless. They are secular. They don't even follow the Jewish religion, which is a false religion. This is not the people of God in that sense. This is a pagan nation. The Jews right now. Now, they will turn to God at some point. We know that. But right now, it's a pretty pagan nation. And they're fighting these other people, and they've been fighting for centuries. And all of that's happening. And you know what? It's all under the rule of Almighty God. And what's going on between Russia and Ukraine? All under the rule of God. And all of the problems happening on our southern border and the things happening in Central and South America is all under the rule of God. And all of the things happening in Europe with the refugees from Muslim nations now pressing into Eastern Europe and even farther into the West is all happening by the rule of God. And so instead of wringing our hands and fretting about all that, we can just say God has a purpose and a plan. And it may not be like we in our American loving, patriotic, loving mindset might hope things will turn out. But the truth is God has a plan. He's working his plan, and he rules over everything. Which leads me to my second point then. We must trust him even during difficult times. You see here, do not listen to the false prophets, he says. In verse 9, don't listen to the false prophets. Excuse me. These are the pagan false prophets. These are the ones in the Gentile nations. And so he calls them diviners, dreamers, enchanters, and sorcerers. Look at verse 14. Don't listen to the words of the prophets that speak to you. And these are the prophets that are in Judea, Jerusalem area. These are Jewish false prophets. And then even down to the priests, he says, don't listen to the prophets at all that prophesy saying the vessels are coming back. That's the end of verse 16. So really what he's saying here is that because God is the one who's in control, listening to his words is a matter of life and death. And that's still really true. That those who say falsely are lying. He says in verse 15, I did not send them. He says they're lying in my name. And if you follow their words, you will die. In verse 13, he says the Gentiles will perish. In verse 15, he says God's people are destroyed. In verse 16, the city itself will be destroyed by following the words of the false prophet. So here you have the people of God who are being told by the prophet of God, you need to stop listening to the false prophets because their lies are going to hurt you. And isn't it interesting that he makes a similarity of comparison between the false prophet and what we would call today to be witches? I mean, the Gentile false prophet are referred to people who practice sorcery. I think pagan prophets are really more like we think of witches, diviners and dreamers and mediums and sorcerers, verse 9. And these pagan prophets do the same work as the false prophets. They're equally liars, verse 15, and their lies result in death. So here you have the false prophets in Israel who claim to be the people of God, who claim to be upholding the tenets of the Old Testament law, and they're preaching to the people. The prophets were the preachers of their day, and they're preaching to the people, and everything they're saying is a lie. And God says, you know what they're really like in comparison? They're really like to those mediums and diviners and dreamers. And you need to understand something. A modern application would be something like this. Anybody who is not preaching the very words of God as revealed in His Word, but they stand up and they say, "Thus saith the Lord," they are the same as the false prophets of the Old Testament. In the New Testament, we call them false teachers. And the application that Peter makes in 1 Peter 2 is to draw our attention to that. They're just the same. And they're just as satanic as anybody would say, go buy a rock and rub it on your arm or meditate on it because that will somehow make you more spiritual. There are people who sell those things in the New Age marketplace. But you listen to people, and I will throw out a name because I have no trouble believing that this is absolutely true. You listen to somebody like Joel Osteen, then you need to understand you're listening to a false prophet. And if you understand the whole flow of what's going on in the Old Testament with false prophets and false teachers in the New Testament, Satan is behind all of that. So anybody who's going to preach in a pulpit and claim to be preaching for God and the words of God, but is not preaching the words of God, is actually doing Satan's work. And you just have to be aware of that. Because God's prophet Jeremiah offers them a pathway forward. It's just not the one they want. In verse 11, the nations will bring their neck under the yoke of the king of Babylon and serve him. Verse 12, I spake to Zedekiah, king of Jerusalem, or Judah, the king of Jerusalem, bring your necks under the yoke of the king of Babylon and serve him and live. Verse 13, why will you die? So Jeremiah says back in verse 1, I'm speaking for God. Verse 12, I'm revealing God's will to you. And verse 11 and verse 13, here's the plan. Serve Babylon and live. But the prophet also reveals God's plan for the rest of the temple treasures to the priests in verse 18. The pillars, the sea where they did all the washings, the bases, all of the residue of the vessels that remained in Jerusalem at that point. He says you should pray for them, that they would not be taken. God's plan is for the treasures rather to be taken, because even as he says pray for them, he knows they're not going to pray. They're false. They don't pray at all. God's plan is for the treasures to be taken. The bronze pillar called Jachin and Boaz from 2 Chronicles 3. The sea where the priests washed before the work, 2 Chronicles 4, verses 4 and 5. The bronze stands where the animals were washed prior to sacrifice, 2 Chronicles 4 and verse 6. All of that would be taken to Babylon. It would all be torn apart into little pieces and would be exported to Babylon so that nothing would be left. And the implication that's being given here in this chapter, there's a hint here, the temple is going to be lost. Remember, there's already been 2 raids. There's another raid coming. If all this is going to be taken to Babylon, they know another raid must be coming. And at that point, the entire city is going to be looted, including whatever remains of any value in the temple. All of it's going to be taken. So because God rules over everyone and his words are true, he doesn't end on a negative note here. He says, rejoice to know that even though you're in exile, God still plans victory for you in the end. And this brings me to my third point. God will win the victory. He absolutely will. Babylon, in the middle of all of this, he says Babylon will be itself destroyed. Verse 7, all the nations will serve him and his son and his son's sons until, do you see that? Just circle that in your Bible. Until the very time of his land come. And then many nations and great kings will, like a smorgasbord, they'll just come and just serve themselves. I'm going to take a little bit of this part of Babylon, take a little bit of that part of Babylon, and he'll just destroy it. Nebuchadnezzar's grandson will be the last of Nebuchadnezzar's line. The head of gold will not live to see the feet of bronze, from Daniel 2. This will be the end of his land, and Babylon is destroyed. And then the other Gentiles will pick apart his kingdom for their own. So the Medo-Persian Empire, being led by Cyrus, will destroy the kingdom, and Cyrus himself will see it to be destroyed. And then he says, look at the end of verse 22, until the day who's that? Not Jeremiah. That's God. Until I visit them, says the Lord. I will bring them up and I will restore them. He's talking about the temple treasures. He say they will be returned. So God is promising to come for those treasures himself. I will come for them and I will restore them to this place, which is a promise of restoration for the temple worship after the exile. So here you are in another country, and you remember the Psalms. They're being led out of Jerusalem, and they're being taken away. Their captor said, sing us a song. And they say, by the rivers of Babylon, we sat down and wept. How can we sing a song in a strange land? They're weeping. It's horrible. They look forward to the day, as one of the psalmists says, when other nations will take your children and murder them like you murdered ours, when you cast our children on the rocks. Babylon was an evil, horrible, godless place, and God says he'll destroy it. And here now people are living in exile, and they're reading this, and they're saying, wait a minute, there's a little sliver of hope, because somewhere in the future, at some time, God is not done with us. He will bring us back. As we conclude, turn over to Daniel chapter 9. And in the first year of Darius, now this is a Persian king. He's Darius the Mede, the son of Ahasuerus, the seed of the Medes, which was made king over the realm of the Babylonians, the Chaldeans. In the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by the books the number of years whereof the word of the Lord came to whom? There you go. So here you have a guy living in the exile. He's an old man. He's lived in Babylon his whole life until Babylon is destroyed. He's already elderly. He's taken to another place in the Middle East. He's taken to the place of the Medes. This is when he ends up in the lion's den. All that's playing itself out. Daniel is actually has a scroll in his hand, and he's reading that scroll. And we don't know if the scroll at this point is that he's reading is in Aramaic or not. It's in Aramaic. It's translated from Aramaic in our Bibles. Maybe he's reading a Hebrew scroll. Maybe he's reading an Aramaic scroll. And if it's Aramaic, it means it's been translated for those people living in the exile. 70 years is a long time. That's generations of people who grow up and don't even know the Hebrew tongue. And Daniel has this scroll, and he's opened this scroll, and what do you think he's reading? He's reading verses like the ones we just read. The time will come, and Babylon's day will end. And he's going, I was there. I saw the fingers of a man's hand. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. You were found in the balances, and you're wanting. And Nebuchadnezzar's grandson was killed that very night, and the Medes and the Persians destroyed, and Babylon the Great is gone. The gates are destroyed, and the place is swamped with other people, and just like Nineveh was destroyed, now Babylon is destroyed. And he can go, everything Jeremiah said was true. And now he reads down to the end of Jeremiah 27, and what do you think he's reading? That all of the vessels that were lost, seemingly lost, many of those are going to be brought back when God visits his people again in Jerusalem. And so Daniel says, I set my face, verse 3, before the Lord, and I prayed, and I prayed, and I repented before God. And you look at this, and I'm saying this, ladies and gentlemen, I have no idea what's going to happen in the United States of America over the next 50, 75 years. I don't know that we'll make it that long. We may make it 300 to 500 more years. I don't know. No kingdom on earth has lasted 300, 400, 500 years. Most of them, I think Rome lasted what is it, like 400 years in the Republic, not even that long, and then you have the Empire, and it's destroyed. What, like 400, maybe into the 400s when it's sacked by the Visigoths. But it's if you call all of that Rome, maybe they lasted the longest, that empire. But it's from the time where they're just, you've got Romulus and Remus living with a wolf, which isn't actually true. But from the time they're in the salt mines to the time where they're a mighty army conquering parts of Great Britain. I mean, that's a long period of time. But even then, it's still defined. We don't have Rome any longer. It's just a city in Italy. It's not like it was. You understand that there's a defined time for our nation. It will end if Jesus tarries. I don't know how long it will be. But as believers, we don't have to fret over all those things. We just say, okay, God's in control. And yes, even when God's in control, He says, trust me. And if you follow my commandments, you will live. This would be at peace in the people in which you are exiled, because there is a coming victory that's certain. And that's when you get to Revelation and you read all of the message that God's giving to his people, saying, yes. And so John says, even so, Lord, come quickly. And that's where we end the story. And we say, Lord, come quickly. Now I know I've taken up all of our prayer time. And I feel sorry for that. And Pastor Joe can make fun of me later because I get on to him when he preaches long. And so I'm going to hear it tomorrow. But I want you to understand that this is not a message of doom. This is a message of hope. Because even though it may be that there's coming a time where God's people will suffer in this land, in a place where there was an amendment, the very first, of our Constitution that gives us freedom to assemble and a freedom of religion, that may go away. And it may be in my grandson's time. It may be in his grandson's time. I don't know. But even if it does, it doesn't matter because what God is actually doing on this planet is something far greater and far different from all of the things that people are doing. What God is actually doing is bringing about the time where Jesus will return and set up his kingdom on earth. And until that time, he says, just occupy, just tarry until I come. So we live here at peace, whether I'm in China, whether I'm in Africa, whether I'm in America, whether I'm in England, whether I'm in South America, it doesn't matter. You tarry till Jesus comes and you obey him and you serve him and you follow him and you say, it's okay because I know the end of this story. He gets the victory. And then we just praise him for that because he does everything well. Let's close in prayer tonight. Father,